Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 141st deck and it's titled A Dinosaur Literally Too Angry to Die. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So, this week, we have a random card suggested to us by Tyler Esme over on Patreon, and that is Zilortha Strength Incarnate. So Zilortha is 3 red-green for a 7/3 dinosaur. They've got trample, and lethal damage dealt to creatures you control is determined by their power rather than their toughness. That means that for all intents and purposes, Zilortha is actually a 7/7, which is going to be pretty efficient considering it's also only 5 mana. Now, with that being said, though, we do have a bit of an unspoken rule on the channel where if our random card is a legendary creature or some other card that could be our commander, we of course have to make it the commander because how else can we build around it at least as efficiently as possible. So we are building around Zilortha this week, so we are a Gruul deck with a couple of major themes. And you may be able to guess theme number 1 as we jump into that. But in this case, our first major theme is going to be very high power creatures. And specifically, I leaned into the high power, low toughness creatures because those are the creatures that are going to work the best with Zilortha. They're the cards that might sometimes have a bit of a downside in the sense that their toughness is so low. But with Zilortha, we can kind of get around that. And a good example of this is Phytotitan, which is 4 green for a 7/2 plant elemental. When it dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of their next upkeep. By being able to have this in play as essentially a 7/7 thanks to Zilortha, and then if it dies we can just bring it back, makes it a lot stronger than if it's a 7/2 that can die to, say, a shock. So that's really what we want to be doing with the deck, is making sure that we have these really high power creatures so that Zilortha makes them just a massively powerful creature, and we can kind of build up an army of unstoppable monsters. Our next major theme, though, is if we're dealing with these high power creatures, we may as well also benefit from that. So we're focusing in on cards that care about creatures having 4, 5, or greater power among all of the creatures that we control. So an example of that is Challenger Troll, which is 4 and a green for a 6/5 troll. Each creature you control with power 4 or greater can't be blocked by more than one creature. This is an incredibly powerful effect because if we can prevent our opponents from sending, 2 4/4s or a bunch of little 1/1s to block one of our creatures and kill it, we can effectively control every single attack that happens, because even Zilortha is just attacking for 7, but if they can only block with one creature, then our opponents need to have a 7 power creature to stop us, or there's no way they're going to be able to kill it. And yes, I know Death Touch can kind of get around that, but we're kind of banking on the fact that our creatures are big enough that they can just stomp over whatever gets in the way, Death Touch or not. And then finally, we got one more theme for this deck. And that theme is going to be trample. Since we have such high power creatures, we need to make sure that they can get through in combat. So a good example of this is Nylea's Forerunner, which is 4 and a green for a enchantment creature beast. It's a 5/3, it has trample, and other creatures you control have trample. Being able to give our entire team a blanket statement of they have trample is incredibly powerful, because even just looking at these 3 creatures, we have a 7/2, a 6/5, and a 5/3 that with Zilortha essentially act as a 7/7, 6/6, and 5/5. So if they can't get through in combat, if they just get stopped by a little 1/1, then we're not doing what we want to be doing with our deck. So we need to make sure that we can trample over what our opponents are doing, because there's no way that they're going to be able to keep up with the level of power that is coming out of a lot of our creatures. But those are our themes for this week. And of course, the next thing we got to do is talk a little bit about some key cards. These are the cards that might synergize very well with what we're doing. They might be win conditions or value engines, something that really helps push our game plan along. The first of those key cards is going to be Dragonborn Champion. We of course need to make sure that we have card draw in the deck, and Dragonborn Champion is one of the best because it is 2, a red and a green for a 5/3 Dragon Warrior. It's got trample, and whenever a source you control deals 5 or more damage to a player, draw a card. Almost all of the creatures in our deck have 5 or more power, so what this essentially says is as long as we can hit an opponent with our creatures, we're going to be drawing cards from it. And that is incredibly powerful because that allows us to refill our board if any of our creatures die. That allows us to keep deploying threats over and over, or keep deploying value pieces and engines like Dragonborn Champion, because trust me, this is not the only card draw engine in here. This deck actually draws a surprising amount of cards, but this is a great way to make sure that we are continuing our game plan and continuing to put our opponents on the defensive to the point where there's not going to be much they can do to stop the card draw, the creatures, and just in general, the beatdown. So that is key card number 1. Number 2 is going to look a little bit different, but this one is Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma. So just as much as we need card draw from Dragonborn Champion, we also need a little bit of ramp. A lot of our creatures cost a lot of mana, and it's tough for us to fill the board if we're spending all of our mana just on 1 or maybe 2 big creatures. That is where Goreclaw comes in, because Goreclaw is 3 and a green for a 4/3 legendary creature bear. Creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. Whenever Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until the end of turn. So we talked a little bit earlier about how trample is so important for this deck. So Goreclaw really does everything that we want out of a card for the deck. It's sitting here making our stuff cost less. It even makes something like Dragonborn Champion just 2 mana. And when you can get a 5/3 trample card draw for 2 mana, that is incredibly efficient and exactly what we want to be doing. And then not only is it making our stuff cheaper, it's pumping up the team, giving them +1/+1, and it's giving them trample. So overall, there is not a single part of Goreclaw that this deck doesn't want to take good advantage of. So Goreclaw really is the unspoken MVP of this entire deck. However, we can't spend our whole time talking just about Goreclaw. We do, of course, have to give some love to key card number 3, which is Sarkhan's Unsealing. And Sarkhan's Unsealing is pretty powerful, all things considered. And it's also one of the main non-combat win conditions in the deck. Overall, we do want to be swinging in with our creatures, and we're probably going to win most games through combat. But Sarkhan's Unsealing gives us another alley to go if that's something we're interested in doing, because it is 3 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever you cast a creature spell with power 4, 5, or 6, Sarkhan's Unsealing does 4 damage to any target. And whenever you cast a creature spell with power 7 or greater, Sarkhan's Unsealing deals 4 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. This is a one-sided board wipe that curves into our commander, because if we have, say, a 4, 5, or 6 power creature, which there are a lot of in this deck, we can just, maybe pick apart one creature or do 4 damage to an opponent. But if we go turn 4 Sarkhan's Unsealing into turn 5 Zilortha, we immediately trigger that second ability, doing 4 damage to each opponent, each creature, and each planeswalker they control, which at that point is almost a board wipe in itself. Plus, it doesn't affect our things, so we can still swing in with whatever massive creatures we've gotten up to that point. So Sarkhan's Unsealing is kind of an unspoken powerhouse, especially when we have a 7 power creature in our command zone just waiting to trigger that second ability. But those are all of our key cards for this week, and the next thing we got to do for this deck tech is talk a little bit about some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize very well together and just kind of help push us toward a victory, even if they're not necessarily win conditions on their own. The first of those cool interactions that I would like to discuss is between Fight Rigging and Impetuous Devils. Now, both of these cards are very strong in this deck in general. Fight Rigging especially, because it cares about having creatures with 7 or greater power, which we will have most of the time. But I wanted to highlight these two in particular because Fight Rigging at 3 mana curves perfectly into Impetuous Devils at 4. So Fight Rigging is 2 and a green for an enchantment. It has Hideaway 5, so when it enters the battlefield, we get to look at the top 5 cards of our library, exile 1 face down, and put the rest on the bottom in a random order. Then, at the beginning of combat on our turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then, if you control a creature with power 7 or greater, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. Which leads us perfectly into Impetuous Devils, which is 2 red for a 6/1 devil. It's got trample and haste, and when Impetuous Devils attacks, up to 1 target creature defending player controls blocks it this combat if able. At the beginning of the end step, sacrifice Impetuous Devils. So the way this would work is on turn 3, we play Fight Rigging. Turn 4, we play the Devils. They move to combat. They get a +1/+1 counter. They now have 7 power. Fight Rigging triggers. We cast our Hideaway card for free. Then we can attack someone with our 7/2 Devils. If, for example, we have Zilortha in play, this is essentially just a 7/7 with trample and haste. And we force something to block it. So if our opponents have their commander out, or if they've got a very relevant creature, maybe like a mana dork, or something that's going to help them forward their game plan, we can force them to block it, so that way it's essentially acting as a removal spell, plus any additional damage tramples over and hits our opponent. So both of these combined are very, very powerful, but they are still pretty good on their own as well. Now, that is cool interaction number 1. The second cool interaction is going to look a little bit different, because our second one is going to be between Kavu Lair and Sparkcaster. And I wanted to highlight these two in particular because, one, we have Kavu Lair and a Kavu, and if you don't know anything about me, I absolutely love Kavu. They are one of my favorite creature types. So any chance I get to showcase some Kavu, I will definitely do so. And Kavu Lair is 2 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater comes into play, its controller draws a card. A couple of things to mention about this. It is a universal effect, so it will help our opponents as well, but it is most likely going to be the most relevant for our deck over our opponents, unless they're playing something similar. And then the reason that that's going to be so good is because we can partner that up with Sparkcaster, which is 2 red-green for a 5/3 Kavu. When Sparkcaster comes into play, return a red or green creature you control to its owner's hand, and when it comes into play, it deals 1 damage to target player. Essentially, what this allows us to do is cast Sparkcaster, draw a card with Kavu Lair, and then return a red or green creature, which is Sparkcaster, to our hand, having done 1 damage to an opponent. As long as we have 4 mana to keep casting Sparkcaster, we can keep casting it over and over, keep doing damage, and keep drawing cards. Plus, we've already mentioned ways like Goreclaw to reduce mana, which would get Sparkcaster down to 2 mana to cast, and all of a sudden it's just 2 mana for a spell that essentially just draws a card and does a damage to an opponent. And if we can keep looping that over and over, we can really start to close out the game, especially with a little bit of help from, some 7/3 dinosaurs. So those are the cool interactions for this week. And the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, the budget is actually pretty low for the deck overall. It only came in at $63.56 out of our total $100 budget limit. And a good portion of that is from a specific card, which is Heroic Intervention. Because Heroic Intervention is a massive $8.79. So if you really wanted to trim the price close to about $55, you could cut Heroic Intervention for some other protection spell. But I do think it earns its spot here because Heroic Intervention is 1 and a green for an instant. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. There are a lot of cards that do one or the other of what Heroic Intervention does, either giving hexproof, giving indestructible, maybe something similar, but there's not a ton of cards that do both, and that is why it's here. It's a great way to protect our board from board wipes, but it's also a great way to protect our board if someone tries to pick off key pieces. Maybe they're trying to kill our card draw, maybe they're trying to kill our commander or our trample creature. We can use Heroic Intervention to save them and still be able to push through damage or push through board wipes. So I do think it's worth the inclusion here, but if you do need to trim it for budget purposes, it could certainly be cut. Now, On the other hand, if you wanted to increase the price of the deck and include an out-of-budget upgrade, I do have one of those for you as well. And it is worth mentioning this isn't technically an out-of-budget upgrade, but because of the recent release of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, when I put this deck together, this was not an option, and it is a very expensive card, so I did want to mention it here because I do think it's worth the include. It is, however, very recent and very expensive. So the out-of-budget upgrade for this week is Ghalta Stampede Tyrant. And Ghalta is 5 green, green, green for a 12/12 legendary creature Elder Dinosaur. They've got trample, and when Ghalta enters the battlefield, put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. That is an incredibly powerful effect that is going to drop just a ton of dinosaurs and beasts and monsters from our hand into play. And most of them are going to have trample, a few of them are going to have haste, and there are definitely ways for this deck to give all of its creatures haste. So if we can just drop Ghalta and then drop a haste enabler and swing in, there's a very good chance that that just closes out the game right there. Now, obviously, if we're putting in a card into the deck, we would have to take a card out. So the card that I would recommend taking out for this is Titania, Protector of Argoth, which is 3 green, green for a 5/3 elemental. When Titania, Protector of Argoth, enters the battlefield, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and whenever a land you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create a 5/3 green elemental creature token. Now, Titania is mainly in here because she is a 5/3 that would become a 5/5 thanks to Zilortha. She makes 5/3s, which would then become 5/5s with Zilortha. But if we're being perfectly honest, we're not built around the land synergies of Titania, and we don't have a ton of lands that would sacrifice themselves or we could bring back. So I don't think it's really worth it if we're looking at what she does as an ability. Now, she is a very powerful card, and if you have a land strategy or you wanted to increase the sacrificing lands of the deck, I do think she would be very, very good. But as the mana base stands, I don't think she's perfect for what we're trying to do, especially when the other option is Ghalta, which is a super, super strong creature for our archetype. But that is the only out-of-budget upgrade I have for this week. So the next thing we've got to do is talk a little bit about ways that you can help support the channel or reach out if that's something you're interested in doing. So I won't go through everything that's on the screen. If you're interested, it is all in the description of the video down below. But all I really want to say is please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you would love to support us on any of the platforms that are listed here, you are certainly welcome to do so. I do, though, want to shout out all of our patrons and channel members because y'all are awesome and I really appreciate all of the support. So a huge thank you to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. So to the 11 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And if you would like to join those lists of names, check us out on Patreon or right here as a channel member on YouTube. There's a ton of great things that you get, including my personal favorite, which is the Discord, where we brew up the decks and also play a lot of the games. I've gotten to know a lot of the patrons very well through the use of that Discord, and they're all great people. So if you're interested in joining an amazing community, please do check it out. But with all of that being said, let's take a look at our opponents and see how we're going to perform with this deck in a game. So this week, we've got 3 opponents as per usual, and we are going to be facing off against Mazzy, True Sword Paladin, being played by Luke, Doran, the Siege Tower, being played by Bilal, and Dong Zhao, the Tyrant, being played by Doodle. Now, if I'm being perfectly honest, looking at this set of opponents with the deck that we are playing, I have openly described this as my nightmare pod because every single opponent really messes with what we're trying to do. Now, Mazzy isn't necessarily on its front side going to mess with what we're doing, but a lot of the auras that Luke is going to be playing are going to be designed to shut down his opponent's attackers or send them somewhere else, which means he might be goading our stuff, it means he might be pacifying our stuff or turning them into 0/1 indestructible bugs, which is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do because we want to be attacking with massively powerful creatures. So if we're getting goaded and we can't attack Luke, then we're a little bit out of luck. Now, believe it or not, that is actually the least of our worries at this table, because we immediately move into Bilal and his Doran deck. And I would argue that Doran is like the arch nemesis of Zilortha, because while Zilortha says that the damage done to my creatures is determined by power, Doran says that each creature assigns combat damage equal to its toughness. Now, if we go back and take a look at some of the creatures we've talked about, for example, Phytotitan, which is a 7/2, that means that is now a 6 mana, 2 power attacking creature with Doran on the battlefield. And that's without Zilortha, is acting as a 2/2. And if we do have Zilortha, it weirdly enough kind of like swaps our power and toughness, meaning that our 7/2 is essentially now a 2/7, which is the literal opposite of what we want to be doing. We want high power, low toughness, and Doran is going to force us to use our toughness, which I would argue makes Doran our natural enemy. So I am 100% most concerned about Doran in this matchup. We have to try to make sure that we are keeping it off the battlefield as much as possible. And then, with still more worries to come through in this game, we have Doodle playing Dong Zhao the Tyrant, which when it comes into play, has a creature deal damage equal to its power to its controller. That, again, is not where we want to be when our commander has 7 power. So all Doodle has to do is pay 5 mana, play Dong Zhao, and then all of a sudden Zilortha is hitting us for 7. But if Doran's on the battlefield, it can only hit us for 7. It would hit all of our opponents for 3. So all of a sudden, all of our power and toughness shenanigans are kind of coming back to bite us a bit with these opponents. So I don't think it's going to be impossible for us to win, but I do want to admit up front that I think it's going to be incredibly challenging for our deck to win through everything that's happening here. I do think it's still going to be a lot of fun. I'm very interested to see what everyone does with their decks, especially Dong Zhao the Tyrant. I've never actually seen this deck, although Doodle has talked about it quite a bit, so I am very excited for it. And I hope you all are as well, but I suppose that is enough rambling from me. So let's jump into this game, let's see how we do, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Luke goes first, followed by Bilal, myself, and then Doodle. On Luke's first turn, he plays a Path of Ancestry. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Arboreal Grazer, letting him put a land from his hand into play tapped, so he plays a Plains. I play a Myriad Landscape. Doodle plays a Spine Rock Knoll, hiding away a card. Luke plays a Mossfire Valley, then casts Kami of Transience, putting a +1/+1 counter on it whenever he casts an enchantment. Bilal misses his land drop but does cast a Soul Ring. I play a Desert of the Fervent. Doodle plays a War Room and then casts Fire Diamond. Luke plays a Plains and casts New Horizons, enchanting his Mossfire Valley so that it can tap for 2 mana of any color, then also puts a +1/+1 counter on the Kami, plus another +1/+1 counter on it thanks to the Kami's own ability. He then moves to combat and attacks Doodle for 4. Bilal casts Gorm the Great, searching his library for his partner, Virtus the Veiled, which he fails to find. Gorm must also be blocked if able, and blocked by 2 or more creatures if able. I play a Command Tower and sacrifice my Myriad Landscape to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Doodle plays a Mountain and casts Karn the Betrayer, which has to attack or block each combat, but prevents all damage that would be done to it, instead having target opponent gain control of it if it would take damage. Finally, it also draws its controller 2 cards when they lose control of Karn. Luke plays a Plains and casts Starnheim Courser, making his artifact and enchantment spells cost 1 less to cast. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts his commander, Doran the Siege Tower, making all creatures assign combat damage equal to their toughness rather than their power. This lets him attack me for 3 with Arboreal Grazer, and Doodle for 7 with Gorm. Doodle blocks Gorm with Karn, giving control of it to Bilal and drawing 2 cards. I play a mountain and cast my commander, Zilortha Strength Incarnate, making it so that lethal damage is dealt to my creatures according to their power rather than their toughness. Doodle plays a mountain and casts his commander, Dongzhao the Tyrant, doing damage to a player equal to the power of target creature they control when he enters the battlefield, this time having Karn do 5 damage to Bilal. Luke plays a Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped, then casts his commander Mazzy Truesword Paladin, giving any enchanted creature +2/+0 and trample when it attacks one of his opponents, and he can also exile an aura he controls when it leaves the battlefield, being able to cast it until the end of his next turn. After that he casts Planar Disruption, enchanting Karn, preventing it from attacking or blocking, also putting a counter on the Kami. He attacks Bilal for 2 with Starnheim Courser, and then passes. Bilal casts Windborn Muse, making each opponent pay 2 mana to attack him with a creature, then he attacks me for 7 with Gorm. Notably, we misunderstand how Gorm works here. I should have had to block it with Zilortha, but we thought it could only be blocked by 2 or more creatures. On my turn, I play a Mosswarp Bridge, hiding away a card, then cast Furious Rise, exiling a card in my end step if I control a creature with power 4 or greater, being able to play it until the next time I exile a card with Furious Rise. This turn, when I go to my end step, I exile a forest. Doodle casts Jeska's Will, making 6 red mana since I have 6 cards in hand, and also exiling the top 3 cards of his library, being able to play them this turn. He then plays a mountain and casts Blasphemous Act, doing 13 damage to each creature, wiping the board except for Karn, which goes back under Doodle's control while Bilal draws 2 cards. Once that resolves, he casts Flame Rush Rider, which creates a tapped and attacking token copy of another attacking creature whenever it attacks. Then Doodle also casts Ensnaring Bridge, preventing creatures with power greater than the number of cards in his hand from attacking, and finally he casts Wayfarer's Bauble and passes. Luke plays a Plains and recasts his commander, Mazzy. Bilal plays a command tower and casts Nature's Lore, searching his library for a forest and putting it into play. Then he casts Carven Caryatid, drawing a card when it enters, and at the end of turn, I cycle a Smoldering Crater. On my turn, I play the forest that was exiled with Furious Rise, then also cast Phytotitan, which returns to my battlefield tapped in my upkeep whenever it dies, and in my end step, I exile Slippery Karst with Furious Rise. On Doodle's turn, he plays a mountain and recasts his commander Dongzhao, making Luke take 3 damage from Mazzy. Luke casts Faldorn Dreadwolf Herald, letting him make a 2/2 wolf token whenever he casts a spell or plays a land from exile. Bilal plays an Arctic Treeline and recasts his commander, Doran. I play a Slippery Karst from exile, then cast Sarkhan's Unsealing, letting me do 4 damage to any target whenever I cast a creature with power 4, 5, or 6, and also letting me do 4 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control when I cast a creature power 7 or greater. Then in my end step, I exile Beast Whisperer with Furious Rise. On Doodle's turn, he plays a mountain and casts Neheb the Eternal, letting him make red mana in his second main phase, equal to the total life lost by his opponents this turn. He moves to combat, attacking me for 6 with Flame Rush Rider and Dongzhao, making a copy of Dongzhao when it attacks, sacrificing the token due to the legend rule, but still triggering his ability, making Luke take 3 from Mazzy. I block Dongzhao with Phytotitan, killing it but not Doodle's commander thanks to Doran, only taking 3 damage. Then, in Doodle's second main phase, he makes 6 red mana since his opponents lost 6 life this turn. This lets him cast Sulfuric Vortex, preventing players from gaining life and doing 2 damage to each player in their upkeep. He also cast Valakut Awakening, putting one card from his hand onto the bottom of his library to draw 2, and finally he sacrifices Wayfarer's Bauble to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. In Luke's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from Sulfuric Vortex, then activates Faldorn, tapping her to discard a card and exile the top card of his library, being able to play it this turn, which he does, playing a Sungrass Prairie and making a wolf token. In Bilal's upkeep, he also takes 2 damage from the Sulfuric Vortex, then casts Mentor of the Meek, letting him pay 1 mana to draw a card whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under his control. After that, he plays a Forest and casts Orion Viper, paying 1 to draw a card when it enters, and also letting him draw a card when it deals combat damage to a player. Finally, he cast Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. In my upkeep, I take 2 damage from Sulfuric Vortex and my Phyto Titan returns to play tapped. Then I cast Beast Whisperer from exile, letting me draw a card whenever I cast a creature spell. I play a Cinderglade, and then I cast Fight Rigging, hiding away a card, and when I move to combat, Fight Rigging triggers, putting a +1/+1 counter on Beast Whisperer. Then, since I control a creature with power 7 or greater, I get to cast the spell Hidden with Fight Rigging for free, casting Workshop Warchief, drawing a card, and doing 4 damage to Flame Rush Rider, killing it. Then in my end step, I exile Loathsome Troll with the Furious Rise. In Doodle's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from his own Sulfuric Vortex, then activates War Room to draw a card and lose a life. He then moves to combat, attacking Luke for 9 with Neheb and Dong Zhao. Before the blocks though, Luke casts Naya Charm to do 3 damage to Neheb, letting him block with Mazi, killing both creatures while Luke still takes 6 thanks to Neheb's Afflict 3. In Doodle's second main phase, he plays a Mountain and casts Burnished Heart. In Luke's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from Sulfuric Vortex, and then once again recasts his commander, Mazi, and passes. In Bilal's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from Sulfuric Vortex, and casts Harmonize, drawing 3 cards. Then he plays a Forest and casts Tadius Juniper Ascendant, letting him draw a card whenever 1 or more of his creatures deals combat damage to a player, also paying 1 for Mentor of the Meek to draw a card. After that, he plays a Krosan Verge, which unfortunately he couldn't have done since he'd already played a land this turn, and moves to combat, attacking Doodle for 3 with Orion Frostfang, and Doodle blocks with Burnished Heart, sacrificing it before damage to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped and taking no damage. At the end of turn, I activate my Mosswort Bridge to cast the card hidden with it, which is Titania, Protector of Argoth, returning Myriad Landscape from my graveyard to the battlefield when she enters, drawing a card, and also doing 4 damage to Mentor of the Meek, killing it. Then in my upkeep, I take 2 damage from Sulfuric Vortex, play a Mountain, and cast Loathsome Troll from exile, doing 4 damage to Karn, letting Bilal gain control of it so Doodle draws 2, and I draw a card. I also cast Drum Hunter, letting me draw a card in my end step if I control a creature with power 5 or greater, drawing for Beast Whisperer, and finally I cast Rampant Growth, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then I move to combat, putting a counter on Beast Whisperer, and attack Doodle for 5 with the Whisperer, and then in my end step, I exile Sheltered Thicket with Furious Rise and draw a card. In Doodle's upkeep, he takes 2 damage from Sulfuric Vortex, plays a Mountain, casts a Soul Ring, and then attacks Bilal for 3 with Dong Zhao. In his second main phase, Doodle casts Furnace of Wrath, doubling all damage that would be dealt, and also casts Life of the Party, which gets +X+O when it attacks, where X is the number of creatures he controls. Then each of his opponents also makes a token copy of it, except theirs are goated for the rest of the game. In Luke's upkeep, he takes 4 damage from Sulfuric Vortex, then activates Faldorn, discarding a card, exiling the top card of his library. This lets him cast Soul Tithe from exile, making a wolf token, and enchanting Ensnaring Bridge, making Doodle pay 3 mana in his upkeep or sacrifice it. He also casts Transcendent Envoy, making his aura spells cost 1 less to cast, and at the end of turn, Bilal casts Despark, exiling my Sarkhan's Unsealing. In Bilal's upkeep, he takes 4 damage from Sulfuric Vortex, and at this point we also remember that Luke's Life of the Party token had to attack, so he retroactively attacks Bilal for 1, but he blocks and kills it. Once that's dealt with, Bilal casts Slaughter the Strong, making each player choose creatures with total power 4 or less, then sacrificing the rest. Before combat, Doodle casts Downhill Charge on Doran, giving him +7/+0 since Doodle controls 7 mountains, preventing Doran from attacking through the Ensnaring Bridge. In response though, Bilal casts Fracture, destroying the Ensnaring Bridge, then attacks me for 2 with Life of the Party, and attacks Doodle for 22 with the rest of his creatures. Doodle blocks the Frostfang, but before damage, Bilal casts Tower Defense, giving his creatures +0/+5, giving him more than enough damage to knock Doodle out of the game while I take 12. Notably, Bilal draws 4 cards here from Tadius, but should have only drawn 2 due to the way that Tadius' ability is worded. In his second main phase, Bilal cast Oracle of Moldiah, letting him play with the top card of his library revealed, play it if it's a land, and play an additional land each turn. Finally, he plays an Exotic Orchard and passes. On my turn, I play a Sheltered Thicket from exile, then cast Colossal Majesty, letting me draw a card in my upkeep if I control a creature with power 4 or greater. I also recast my commander Zilortha, drawing a card, and when I move to combat, I put a counter on Zilortha with Fight Rigging, then attack Bilal for 1 with the Life of the Party. Finally, in my end step, I exile Dragonborn Champion with Furious Rise. On Luke's turn, he simply untaps and then passes. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1, then casts Zetalpa Primal Dawn. He also casts Angel of Destiny, so whenever his creatures deal combat damage to a player, Bilal and that player both gain that much life. Then if Bilal has 15 or more life than his starting life total, the player he dealt damage to loses the game. He moves to combat and attacks me with half of his board for 9 damage, and I block the Oracle of Moldiah and Life of the Party, killing them but still taking 6 while Bilal draws 3. Notably, Bilal and I should have both gained 6 here thanks to the Angel, and he should have only drawn 2 cards, but we missed that at the time. In my upkeep, I draw a card for Colossal Majesty, then I play a Temple of the False God and cast Dragonborn Champion, letting me draw a card whenever a source I control deals 5 or more damage to a player, and I also draw for Beast Whisperer. After that I cast Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma, drawing a card, making my creatures with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast, and also giving those creatures +1/+1 in trample whenever Goreclaw attacks. Then, thanks to the cost reduction, this lets me cast Sparkcaster for only 2 mana, doing 1 damage to Bilal when it enters, drawing a card and returning itself to my hand. I also cast Zalto Fire Giant, drawing a card and then venturing into the dungeon whenever it's dealt damage. When I move to combat, I put a +1/+1 counter on Zilortha with Fight Rigging, and attack Bilal for 11 with Life of the Party, Zilortha, and Beast Whisperer, but he blocks everything, killing Zilortha and the Whisperer, taking no damage. At the end of turn, I exile a mountain with Furious Rise. Luke casts Mesa Enchantress, letting him draw a card whenever he casts an enchantment, and also casts Claws of Valakut, drawing a card and enchanting Mazzy to give her first strike and +1/+0 for each mountain he controls, which is currently 0. He then plays a command tower and passes. Bilal casts Assault Formation, making his creatures do damage equal to their toughness, and letting him pay 1 mana to allow one of his defenders to attack this turn, or pay 3 mana to give creatures he controls +0/+1 until the end of turn. He moves to combat, attacking Luke with Zilortha for 16, having both players gain 16 life, while Bilal draws 2 cards. Then, in his second main phase, Bilal casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into his hand and the other onto the battlefield tapped. He plays a Swamp, then casts Pestilence, letting him pay a black mana to do 1 damage to each creature and player, sacrificing the enchantment when there are no creatures in play. In my upkeep, I draw a card with Colossal Majesty, then play a mountain and cast Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia, which gets a +1/+1 counter and untaps whenever I cast a creature with power 5 or greater. I also cast Ronus the Indomitable, putting a counter on Gwenna. I cast Raging Poltergeist, putting a counter on Gwenna. I cast Anax, Hardened in the Forge, putting yet another counter on Gwenna, and cast Beacon Behemoth, putting another counter on Gwenna, and allowing me to pay a mana to give a creature with power 5 or greater vigilance until the end of turn. When I move to combat, I put a +1/+1 counter on life of the party, using it to attack Bilal for 2, but he finally blocks it with Zilortha, killing it. And in my end step, I exile a forest with Furious Rise. On Luke's turn, he simply draws and passes, but at the end of his turn, Bilal activates Pestilence twice, doing 2 damage to each creature and player. This kills my Poltergeist and Luke's Enchantress and Envoy, but it does also let me venture into the dungeon twice, going into the Tomb of Annihilation, making each player lose a life, and then I discard a card, sacrifice a creature, an artifact, and a land. On Bilal's turn, he immediately activates Pestilence 2 more times, letting me venture once, finishing the Tomb of Annihilation, making the Atropal token, and then I get knocked out of the game by the second activation. Once that's resolved, Bilal activates Assault Formation 4 times, giving his creatures +0/+4 until the end of turn. This lets him attack Luke with Zilortha and Angel of Destiny, doing 20 damage on first strike damage, knocking him out before the Angel can trigger, even through a Back to Nature from Luke to destroy all enchantments, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. I definitely predicted it up front. This was a very challenging pod for us to deal with Zilortha. Having to deal with Doran especially really shut our game plan down a lot more than I expected. I figured we might still be able to get in for a little bit of damage here and there, but having Doran combined with the Ensnaring Bridge from Doodle really just locked us out of the game for a good portion of it. And I tried to be able to take Doran out with our Sarkhan's Unsealing, but I could never quite get to the point where we could do multiple hits with it because Doran had an annoying 5 toughness and Sarkhan's Unsealing only did 4. But I do think overall the deck was a lot of fun. I think it showed its power. I think that without Doran in play, we really would have been the main deck at the table, just dishing out a ton of damage and dealing with every threat that came our way. Especially when we could refill our hand very efficiently. There were a lot of cards drawn from this deck, a lot of creatures put into play. And I think that we really just kind of got unlucky with our opponents in this one. But overall, the deck was still super, super fun. Moving around the table to talk about everybody else's decks, though. Doodle's Dong Zhao deck was also very sweet. I didn't expect the mono red clones to be as effective as they were, because he was able to slap people with Dong Zhao like 4 or 5 times throughout the course of that game, which was very impressive. So overall, very cool. I do hope we get to see that deck again. I'm sure we will, knowing Doodle. He's, like I said, talked about it quite a bit. Luke and his Mazzy deck, also very cool. There was a lot of reducing costs for auras and enchantments, which I think would have been a lot more effective if there had been an earlier Enchantress on the board rather than the Mesa Enchantress right at the end, but still very cool. I think he flooded out a little bit from what Luke was saying, so that was a little unfortunate. Maybe next time that Mazzy shows up, there won't be quite as many lands, but we will see. And then finally, of course, got to talk about Bilal's winning Doran deck. This deck was, I keep saying it, but it really was our arch nemesis at that table. It really shut down everything we were doing and surprisingly worked kind of with what everybody else was doing, because while Doodle was trying to shut down people with Ensnaring Bridge, Bilal really didn't care about the Ensnaring Bridge being able to attack with a 0 power creature and still hit someone for 5. So everything really just kind of fell into place for the Doran deck, and there were a couple of mistakes made in the game that unfortunately did give a little bit of assistance to Bilal. I don't think that they really mattered in the long run. I think he still would have won either way, but it is worth mentioning. Make sure you're reading your cards. We definitely got caught up with a couple of cards in this game, and this obviously is not a slight on Bilal in any way. We were all a part of the game. We all could have caught things and didn't. But there's a lot happening. There's a lot going on in Commander games. Everyone makes mistakes. So definitely something to be aware of for next time. And I definitely have learned about Angel of Destiny. That is one that I will probably have to play around with myself, because that card is very cool. But with all of that being said, I've certainly talked enough about each of these decks. Let me know down in the comments if you think there's any cards that we should have included in our deck and didn't, maybe any cards that you think shouldn't be included but were, or anything else you'd like to talk about, plus any suggestions you may have for future videos. So with all of that being said, I hope you all enjoyed the deck tech, hope you enjoyed the game, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.